It's another quiet night. Quiet outside, at least. Inside your head, things might be noisier. Thoughts swirling, memories showing up uninvited. That to-do list whispering in the dark. Or maybe it's not thoughts at all. Maybe it's just a feeling. Heavy, restless, a little lonely. You're tired, but sleep won't come. Not easily. Not yet. Maybe it's anxiety. Maybe it's grief. Maybe it's nothing you can name, just the ache of being human in a world that's always asking for more. You're not alone. You don't need to do anything right now. You don't need to solve, improve, explain, or even fall asleep. You just need a place to rest. A soft story, a gentle rhythm, a little time away from now. So, let's go back. Not to castles or coronations, not to knights or plagues or epic battles. Let's go somewhere quieter, somewhere more ordinary. Let's visit a medieval village and sit down for dinner with the people. History often forgets. Not kings, not nobles, just regular folks. Mothers, fathers, shepherds, bakers, children with dirty knees and wind-burned cheeks. People whose names never made it into books, but who still woke up every day hungry. You blink and find yourself sitting by a hearth. It's not quite a kitchen, more like a room with a fire pit and a few wooden stools. The walls are wattle and daub. The floor is dirt. There's smoke in the air. Always smoke. A pot hangs above the fire, bubbling quietly. You don't know what's in it. No one really does. It's just stew, a little barley, a few root vegetables, maybe a bone or two if someone got lucky, maybe a bit of cabbage, maybe yesterday's bread torn up and dropped in to soften. This is pottage. It's what's for breakfast and lunch and dinner. It's what's always for dinner. You lift a wooden spoon and stir. It's thick, smells earthy. Not bad, not great. Just filling, which for most people was the point. Meat rare, spices unheard of, fresh fruit. Only in season, and even then, it belonged to someone else's orchard. Your host hands you a rough piece of bread. It's hard like a brick, made from rye or barley, dark coarse, sometimes laced with bits of grit from the millstones. You chew carefully. It fills your stomach. It won't kill you. That's the win. A child sits nearby with a bowl of the same stew. They smile at you, shy, gap-toothed, sleepy. Tomorrow they'll wake early to gather firewood or help in the fields. But for now, they sit and eat, just like you. Outside the sun is setting. A rooster calls late, confused. The village is quieting. A dog barks once. A baby fusses. The wind slips under the door. And the stew keeps bubbling. Thick, reliable, a kind of survival in a pot. If this voice is helping you feel even a little more at peace, you're welcome to like or subscribe. Only if it makes your night softer. No pressure here. So, where are you right now? Still in bed, one hand under the pillow, wrapped in an old sweatshirt that still smells like comfort, lying quietly eyes closed. But your brain's still whispering in the background. However you're here, you're allowed to rest. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath slow down. You don't need to chase sleep. Just let yourself drift, like steam rising from a pot you didn't have to stir. Tonight we'll stay a while in this little cottage where food was simple, life was hard, but still they laughed, they worked, they loved, and they ate what they had. Let's begin. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world of mud huts, flickering hearths, and meals that look like, well, let's just say they won't be appearing on any modern menu. You're sitting cross-legged on a rough wooden floor, a clay bowl cradled in your hands. It's warm. Steam curls upward, and inside that bowl, a lumpy brownish stew that's equal parts porridge soup and mystery. It smells earthy, like boiled grains and onions, maybe a hint of wild herbs. You take a bite. It's not bad, not good either, but it fills the space in your stomach, and in the Middle Ages, that's what mattered most. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our sleepy history circle grow across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a medieval village early morning. There's no clatter of pans or the smell of bacon. This isn't that kind of story. Instead, someone stokes a fire with damp wood. The smoke curls lazily up through a hole in the thatched roof, and the air smells more like ash than breakfast. In your bowl is pottage, possibly the most important food for poor people in the Middle Ages. Pottage isn't glamorous. It's not even a dish, really. It's a concept, a method, a bubbling, evolving pot of food that sits on the fire day and night, absorbing whatever ingredients are around. It might start as barley or oats slowly simmered in water. Then someone adds cabbage. Then maybe some leeks or a handful of wild garlic. Maybe a bit of bacon fat from last week's butchering if someone was lucky. It's thick and mushy somewhere between soup and oatmeal. You eat it with a wooden spoon or just slurp from the bowl if no one's watching. It's warm, and that warmth seeps into your bones, especially in the damp chill of an English spring. It's not exciting, but it keeps you alive. Historians still argue whether pottage was always bland or occasionally seasoned with foraged herbs, especially during early spring when fresh greens started poking out of the soil. Some manuscripts suggest people use things like parsley mint or even nettles, not because they were fancy, but because they were there. And sometimes if the stars aligned or your landlord threw you a bone, there'd be meat. A bone, literally. It might sit in the pot all week, flavoring the mush with just enough savory essence to make it taste slightly less like boiled socks. You sit back stomach full in that slow, satisfying way. No food coma here, just a quiet fullness and the comfort of knowing you won't go hungry today. Pottage was more than just food. It was a way to stretch ingredients, a peasant's secret weapon, against hunger. A communal thing, too. Families shared it, and sometimes entire villages would pool resources during lean times. In the winter months, the pottage could get pretty sad. Root vegetables, dried beans, maybe old grains from the previous year. But in summer and fall, that's when the bowl got colorful. Today, though, your bowl is brown, a thick, sticky kind of brown. You glance at someone else's bowl and notice a chunk of something floating in theirs. Meat, a carrot. It's hard to tell. You trade glances. They shrug. It doesn't matter. You eat what's in front of you. Quirky detail. Some medieval folks, especially the deeply superstitious, believed you could cure illness by adding certain things to the pottage: crushed snails, frog liver, even powdered bone. These weren't flavor enhancers. Let's be clear. They were early medicine, or maybe just wishful thinking with a spoon. And when the pottage wasn't enough, bread stepped in. But we'll get to that in the next section. Right now you lean back against the rough timber wall, licking your spoon clean. There are no seconds. Not today. The pot needs to last until tomorrow or longer. Outside, a neighbor tosses a wilted cabbage leaf into the communal pot. A kid picks dandelions. Yes, they're edible. An older woman crushes dry herbs between stones, muttering something about warming the blood. The day stretches ahead. There's work to do, but for now you've eaten. Not well, not extravagantly, but enough. And in the Middle Ages, for the poor, enough was the highest compliment food could get. Your bowl is empty now, but the taste of the pottage still lingers, a strange, almost metallic note that might have come from the pot itself. Or maybe the onion that had been hanging above the hearth for weeks. Either way, it doesn't matter, because next, someone hands you a piece of bread. And this isn't your modern, soft, white, fluffy loaf. No buttered toast, no sourdough with a golden crust. This is dense, heavy. A small brick of survival. Bread in the Middle Ages was not a luxury for the poor. It was a daily essential. But it was also very, very different depending on your status. While the wealthy might nibble on soft white loaves made from refined wheat, peasants chewed on something much closer to a hardened slab of barley or rye, sometimes oats, sometimes all three mashed together in a gritty, chewy lump. You bite in. There's a crunch. That's not crust. That's sand. See, the process of milling grain in medieval Europe was crude. The local millstone, often shared by a village, was worn down over time. Bits of grit ended up in the flour. So every bite of bread also ground down your teeth, literally. Archaeologists can still identify medieval peasants by the smooth, worn-down molars in their skulls. Bread didn't just feed you, it filed you. You chew slowly. It takes a while. This is the kind of bread you eat with purpose. No dipping in olive oil, no jam, no sliced avocado. Just plain cold bread. Maybe dunked in your leftover pottage, if you're lucky. Despite this, bread was precious. It was central. If you didn't have bread, something was wrong. And it wasn't just food, it was wages. A farmhand might be paid partially in loaves. A servant might receive bread and board as part of their compensation. And on Sundays, that's when things got interesting. In some parts of Europe, the church distributed blessed bread after Mass. This wasn't symbolic like communion wafers. It was actual bread meant to feed the poor. Some people saw it as holy. Others saw it as breakfast. And still historians argue whether that bread, especially the kind given by the clergy, was truly meant for nourishment or if it was a gesture, a performance of charity. The texture probably didn't change either way. Then there was maslin. Maslin wasn't a grain, it was a mix. Rye and wheat usually, sometimes oats, sometimes just whatever was available. It was cheaper than pure wheat flour, more forgiving in poor soil, and therefore the default for many peasant families. The result, a loaf that never tasted the same twice. There's a myth that medieval peasants only ate black bread. That's not entirely true. Black bread, meaning very dark and coarse, was common, but the color varied depending on the grain and how well it was sifted. In bad years, the bread might be greenish, even a little moldy. You just cut around the spots. Or didn't. Now you might think, well, at least it's nutritious. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong. This heavy bread, unrefined and full of bran, had fiber, protein, even a few minerals. Compared to the airy loaves of modern white bread, a slice of medieval maslin had substance, calories, sustenance. But it was also the same. Every day, breakfast bread, lunch bread with a thin ale, dinner bread with pottage, snacks. If you were rich, cheese, honey. If you were poor, more bread. It wasn't exciting, but it was survival. And bread, strangely enough, became a kind of cultural dividing line. In feasts and banquets, the rich used trenchers, flat slabs of stale bread, as plates. Once the meal was over, the greasy trenchers might be given to servants, or beggars, or dogs. It was a sort of hand-me-down dinnerware that sometimes doubled as dessert. Quirky detail. Some households reused the same batch of sourdough starter for decades, like actual generations. If the dough died, it was a tragedy, a bad omen. One chronicler claimed a family buried their dead starter in the garden and prayed over it. Probably not a widespread practice, but it says something about how seriously they took their carbs. And let's not forget famine bread. During bad harvests, people stretched flour with whatever they could find, bean husks, acorns, even tree bark. Yes, bark, peeled, ground, and added to the dough. It gave the bread a strange texture and a worse reputation. You take another bite of your current loaf. It's rough, crumbly, but it's enough. You watch a child nearby carefully fold their crust into a cloth. They'll save it for later, or for someone else, or maybe even trade it. Because in this world, bread wasn't just food. It was currency, symbol, lifeline. And as you lean back and listen to the gentle crackle of the fire, you realize bread wasn't a side dish. It was the main event, day after day, year after year. And yet somehow, Miraculously, it kept people alive. The morning air carries a quiet chill, and your hands are still a little stiff from sleeping on a straw-stuffed sack. But hunger wakes you before the sun fully rises. Again. Always again. The loaf of muslin bread you saved is gone, shared last night with a neighbor who lost her own during the storm. That's just how it works here. In the peasant class, hunger is communal. So is resilience. But today there's hope of something different. Someone whispers that a peddler has arrived in the village. You stretch your back, wipe the dew from your brow, and make your way down the muddy path to the center of town. It's not exactly a market day, but any day, someone arrives with food as a reason to gather. And what does the peddler bring? Fish. Well, kind of. Preserved fish. Salted and dried until it resembles a piece of wood, really. Cod, most likely. But not the juicy, flaky kind pulled straight from the sea. No, this cod has been traveling inland for weeks, maybe months, packed in barrels and stored with salt. It's stiff, pale, almost translucent. You buy a piece, well, you trade for it. A woven bundle of herbs, a handful of rough linen, and a promise to help mend the peddler's cloak. Deals are always strange like this. Back home you soak the fish in water, as your grandmother taught you, for hours. It softens a little. Then into the pot it goes. Not pottage this time, but a thin fish broth, your attempt at Friday food. Because here's the thing, in medieval Europe, religion wasn't just a belief. It was the kitchen schedule. Friday was a fish day. So was Wednesday, sometimes Saturday, and every day during Lent. Which means for nearly half the year, you didn't eat meat. If you were wealthy, you still dined, well, lobster, eel, oysters. But for the poor, fish meant preserved herring, dried cod, or whatever you could pull from the nearest stream. Historians still argue whether these religious food laws helped or harmed the poor. Some claim they gave people variety. Others suggest they increased malnutrition, especially in years when fish was scarce or overpriced. Your broth smells faintly of the sea, or what used to be the sea. You tear off a piece of bread and dip it in. It's warm, briny, not exactly delicious. But today it feels like a feast. You think about how far that fish traveled. From the North Sea, maybe, across rivers, through merchant carts, sitting in salt for weeks. All that effort for a peasant's bowl of soup. You slurp slowly, savoring every mouthful. In some villages, people made a dish called peasant fish pie, a grand name for mashed fish bones, oats, wild onion, and if you're lucky, a dash of beer. It's more like a paste served on leaves or thick slices of bread. You're not sure whether that counts as pie, but no one here questions the name. It's filling, and the salt keeps it from spoiling quickly. Quirky detail. There was once a folk tale about a woman who buried her salted fish in the garden to hide it from bandits. Months later, when she dug it up, she claimed it had gained wisdom and only shared it with people she deemed worthy. The story spread, and for a while villagers believed that buried fish could ward off illness if eaten during storms. Historians still debate Whether this was ritual satire or just a bored storyteller trying to make leftovers sound magical, you finish your broth, set the bowl aside, and stare into the fire. Across the room, someone hums a song, an old one, about herring boats and fishermen who never came back. You don't know the words, but the melody feels like sea wind and cold mornings. For a brief moment, the fish broth feels like a connection to distant shores, to strangers you'll never meet, to rituals that keep time moving forward even when days feel the same. You wipe your mouth on your sleeve. There's no dessert, but your belly is warm, and that's enough. You step outside, and for a moment the light catches on the dew-soaked garden. It isn't much, just a rough patch of soil behind the cottage, edged with stones and half shaded by an overhanging thatch roof. But here, in the humblest square of earth, is where a medieval peasant's pantry begins. Your knees creak a little as you squat down and brush your hands across the soft, slightly damp leaves of sorrel. The smell is sharp lemony, almost. It will go into the pot tonight. A splash of brightness in the otherwise gray palette of peasant food. Vegetables in the Middle Ages were not side dishes. They were the meal, and you didn't buy them. You grew them or you didn't eat. You glance around at what's growing. Cabbage, of course. Leeks. Maybe a few knobby turnips poking their leafy tops above the soil. In the far corner, broad beans, sturdy and faithful. Their thick pods, curled like sleeping caterpillars, not glamorous, but dependable. And then there's the kale, not the trendy massaged kind from your local health store. This kale has leaves like dinosaur skin, rough, dark curly, and wind toughened. You'll boil it until it's soft, then boil it some more. Because that's the trick. If it doesn't melt in your mouth, it scratches on the way down. Peasant gardens weren't ornamental. Every plant had a job. And the soil, it was worked by hand. No irrigation system, just prayer sweat and manure. You'd compost scraps, scoop out the muck from the chicken coop, even trade with your neighbor for donkey dung. Every handful mattered. You pluck a young parsnip. It's thin and twisted, but edible. You pop it into your bag and keep moving. In the Middle Ages, vegetables didn't carry prestige. They were humble, which is ironic because historians now marvel at the sheer variety that peasants managed to grow in their small plots. Scurvy rare, fiber plenty, vitamins hidden in the leaves of forgotten herbs. Still nobody praised your kale stew at banquets. You remember the herbal strip behind the cottage? It's not for food, it's for medicine. Calendula, fennel, garlic, dill. Useful in the pot, yes, but also mashed into poultices and mixed into teas. You once heard someone say, garlic kept demons away. You're not sure it's true, but it definitely keeps neighbors at arm's length. And then there's the strange things. Lovage, Good King Henry, Alexander's, names that sound like saints or minor royalty. They're wild plants, half weeds, but they grow where nothing else will. The poor knew which to pick, which to cook, and which to avoid. One of your neighbors swears by stinging nettles. Boiled down, they're tender and green, rich in iron, they say. You've tried them. Not bad. As long as you wear gloves. You reach for a basket left on a stone step. Inside, a few withered carrots, purple-skinned and twisted. Not the orange ones you know today. Those were still a few hundred years away. These medieval carrots are earthy and tense, a bit bitter, but they stew nicely with onions and barley. Quirky detail. In some parts of Europe, peasants used beetroot as hair dye before they ever thought to eat it. A rich wine-red stain rubbed onto the scalp before festivals or courtship. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or a peculiar regional trend. But the image of someone dyeing their hair before chewing the leftovers feels oddly poetic. Your fingers trace the wooden slats of the garden fence. The sun rises higher now, illuminating the rows in full. Everything is alive in its own sleepy way. Behind you, a goat bleats. Sometimes, if you're lucky, the animal dung helps your crops thrive. Sometimes it just makes your potatoes smell like barn. You chuckle to yourself. This patch of land, this green rectangle carved out of the mud and wind, feeds you, season by season. Spinach in spring leeks in winter beans when they're willing. It's never enough, but it's never nothing. You remember the time a heavy frost killed half your crop. You survived on cabbage soup and boiled onions for 3 weeks. Your skin itched from the roughness of winter leaves, but you made it through because you knew your garden and it knew you. A single row of kale might not look like much, but tonight, after boiling it with onion and barley, it'll feel like something warm, something real. And in a world where most days blur together, that's all you need. You sit on the short wooden stool near the hearth, the fire cracking softly beside you. In your lap rests a small sack, coarse linen, tied with an old piece of twine. It isn't heavy, just a few cups worth of dried peas and fava beans, pale and speckled like old ivory. You untie the knot carefully, as if opening treasure, because in the medieval peasant's world, this is treasure. Beans and peas might not seem exciting. They don't sizzle like bacon, and they certainly don't impress the neighbors. But they do one thing that most other peasant food fails at. They fill your belly and keep it full. Protein fiber. A touch of comfort legumes were the quiet champions of the medieval poor. You toss a few of the dried peas into a pot of water, watching them sink and settle at the bottom like smooth stones. They need time. Hours. Maybe more. That's how it works. Everything in this world takes time. In truth, people back then didn't really talk about protein. They didn't know amino acids from alchemy, but they did know which meals kept them standing during harvest, which meals made the children sleep more soundly, and which ones kept hunger at bay longer than cabbage stew. That was beans, broad beans, fava beans, field peas, lentils, if you were really lucky. Chickpeas were known, sure, but mostly in the South. Up here in your damp northern plot of Europe, it's all about the humble fava. Chunky, earthy, a little chalky if you don't soak it right. You remember stories your grandmother told of bean cakes baked on flat stones, of pea gruel thickened with barley to make it stretch, of villagers arguing over whose lentil stew was better, though they all tasted the same, more or less. Mostly, she talked about how essential beans were during the hunger gap, that strange, cursed time in early spring when the winter stores had rotted or run out, but the new crops hadn't ripened yet. You'd have a month sometimes, too, where all you had were dried goods, beans, peas, maybe a few shriveled onions and turnips. It was like holding your breath until the land exhaled again. You glance down at the pot. A few bubbles rise lazily. The peas are beginning to soften. Quirky fact, in some places beans weren't just food. They were fortune tellers. You'd put a dry bean under your pillow to dream of your future spouse, or toss a handful into a fire to see if it popped and cracked an omen of good or bad luck. Historians still argue whether this was pagan ritual lingering under Christian roofs, or just the natural superstition of hungry minds looking for meaning. You stir the pot gently. Add a pinch of salt, maybe a leek chopped thin. If you had pork fat, you'd use it. But that's for holidays. For now, the peas are the meal. You lean closer to the fire, letting the warmth touch your face. Beans also had one other gift, though not everyone would call it that. They helped you survive Lent. You couldn't eat meat or animal fat. Remember, but beans, totally fine. Filling, forgiving, and cheap enough that even the poorest family could keep a sack on hand for emergencies. They were also, to put it delicately, noticeable. You remember the song children used to sing something about noisy beans and the farting friar. Everyone laughed. But you knew it wasn't just a joke. It was the body's way of saying, hey, thanks for the sustenance. Sorry about the smell. You smile. Some things haven't changed. The fire pops, sending a few sparks dancing up the chimney. You ladle out a bowl full of steaming pea stew. It's thick now, creamy almost. The kind of meal you eat slowly, not because you're savoring it, but because it's the only bowl you've got. You take a bite. The peas have broken apart, gone soft and mushy. The flavor is subtle but comforting, earthy, real, and for a few moments you feel full in every way that matters. Some lords may feast on venison and boar. Some monks may sip wine and nibble white cheese. But here in your cottage with your bean stew and your rough clay bowl, you have something more durable than indulgence. You have sustenance, reliability, and just enough warmth to make it through another day. You raise the mug to your lips, and it's not wine, not even water. It's ale, not the strong, hearty brew served in taverns with slurred songs and slamming fists, but something much thinner, gentler. Small ale, they call it. Barely alcoholic, but enough to kill the nastier bugs lurking in your local water source. Because here's the thing, no one drinks straight water. Not if they can help it. In medieval villages, Rivers double as laundry sites, bathing pools and sewage channels. Wells sometimes taste of rust and moss. That clear liquid from the stream, it might sparkle, but drink too much and you'll sparkle your way to the grave. So you sip ale, not for the buzz, but for the safety. You set your mug down and look at the wooden pitcher beside it. It's a little cloudy, and there's a faint smell of yeast, like someone mixed bread and damp hay. But it's familiar, and that counts for something. Your neighbor brews it in a smoky shed out back. She uses barley, sometimes oats, and a mash of leftovers from bread making. Boils it, strains, it lets it sit. If she's feeling fancy, she might toss in herbs, maybe some yarrow or mugwort. Bitter, earthy, and just enough kick to feel alive. Ales come in all shapes and strengths. Rich nobles drank strong, heady brews. Monks brewed their own sometimes, with surprising sophistication. But for you, it's small beer, something the whole family can drink, even the children. And they do, all day long, because hydration still matters when you're threshing wheat for 10 hours or digging ditches with a wooden spade. Ale gives calories too, just a few, but they count. You remember once, during a particularly hot harvest week, the only thing standing between you and a fainting spell was a swig of ale mixed with porridge. That was a thing, by the way. Ale gruel, thin, drinkable porridge, warmed by leftover beer. It sounds ridiculous until you've gone 3 days without a proper meal. Fun detail. In some towns, ale brewing was mostly women's work. The alewives ruled the village drink trade, brewing in tubs bigger than their bathtubs and selling by the jug. Some became local legends, respected, feared, or occasionally accused of witchcraft when their brew turned too good or too popular. Historians still argue whether this witchy association was tied more to their power or their skill with herbs. Your neighbor thankfully just swears a lot and keeps a mean cat. Witchy enough. You tilt your mug again. The ale's gone a little flat, but it's cold and wet. That's all you need. On rare days, you get something else. Maybe a sour cider made from wind-fallen apples, or a weak wine mixed with water if you're visiting someone wealthier. But most of the time, it's ale or nothing. Water only in desperation. And even then, you might boil it first, or add herbs, or just pray. You remember a story from years ago about a young man who tried drinking from the village pond during a drought. They found him 2 days later, curled like a fern, his stomach bloated, eyes glassy. You never forgot that. You sip again. This time, slower. The warmth of the ale doesn't come from alcohol. It comes from familiarity, from trust. Even the church knew the role of ale. On feast days, the amount you could drink might triple. Monks brewed gallons. Pilgrims survived entire journeys on nothing but bread and beer. In fact, some monasteries became known less for their prayers and more for their fermentation skills. You've tasted one once, thick, dark, sweet, and completely unlike your neighbor's daily brew, but you wouldn't trade. Not really. Her ale is yours. Local. Honest. Probably got a beetle or two in it, but hey, extra protein. You wipe your mouth with the back of your sleeve and set the mug aside. The jug is still half full. It'll last the day. Outside you hear a rooster crow. Morning again. Time to haul water, gather firewood, tend to the barley patch, if the rain holds. But first, a sip. Because this is how you begin. How everyone begins. And while others may toast with golden goblets and imported wine, you raise your wooden mug chipped at the rim and drink to survival. You step just beyond the edge of the village, the low hum of life behind you, fading beneath the rustling trees. In your hand, a simple woven basket light for now, but soon to brim with whatever nature chooses to offer today. You're not off to market. You're foraging. The forest doesn't care if you're rich or poor. It doesn't care if you own land or live in a hut with no chimney. What it does care about, though, perhaps not consciously, is timing, seasons, knowing when the berries ripen, when the nuts fall, and when the mushrooms begin to appear after a cool rain. That's the true skill of survival. You stoop low and find the first of many bramble bushes. The blackberries are small, darker than ink, and nestled behind thorns that punish haste. You pluck carefully, fingers already smudged with juice and scratched pink. These berries won't last long. Eaten fresh, mashed into a kind of preserve, or dried by the fire if you're lucky. You're not thinking jam and scones. You're thinking calories. Further in, you spot a patch of wild garlic. Its smell cuts through the air like a sharp whisper. Pungent green, familiar. You kneel, tearing leaves from the base, avoiding the roots so it regrows. This'll go in tonight's pottage, maybe hide the taste of the turnips. You whisper a quick thanks, not out loud, but in that way, you've learned to respect the forest like it's watching. You remember your mother's voice from years ago. Only pick what you can name. It wasn't just advice. It was a rule. Because among the wild treasures are dangers that don't announce themselves. Mushrooms, especially. You squint down at a cluster near a tree. Base tall stalks, broad caps, white gills. They look like something you've seen before. But were those the good ones? Or the ones that make you see angels and then stop breathing? You leave them. Better safe than sorry. Quirky tidbit. In some villages, foraging came with unspoken rules. Even though no one really owned the woods, there were certain spots considered spoken for. That hollow behind the churchyard, the grove near the mill. If you picked there, you'd find yourself facing stern words, or worse. Historians still debate whether these rules were enforced through law tradition or just the threat of Aunt Milda's wrath. You move along the path, and the sun filters through the canopy above. It's not exactly peaceful. You're swatting gnats every few seconds, but it's quiet, and that counts. You find a walnut tree, not too generous, but enough. A few green husks lie beneath it, already cracked open by squirrels. You gather the remains carefully, inspect each nut. Some are too far gone, blackened inside. Others are good, surprisingly so. A bit of fat, a bit of crunch. You remember when you were 10 and someone dared you to eat an acorn straight from the ground, bitter as sin. But later, your grandmother showed you how to leach the tannins in water, roast them slow, and turn them into flour. It wasn't great, but it worked. That's a recurring theme in your life. Things that weren't great, but worked. You reach a small stream. The banks are muddy, but you know this is where watercress hides, and sometimes, if you're lucky, wild mint. You dip your hand in, careful not to stir the mud too much, and snap off a few crisp sprigs. You sniff. Clean, cold, sharp. That'll brighten the stew. Not everything out here is food, though. Some of it becomes medicine. Dandelion root for digestion. Elderberries for fever. Meadowsweet for aches. You don't fully understand how it all works, but the old women do. Their hands shake when they pick, but never hesitate. You pass the skeleton of a fallen tree. Insects buzz lazily around it. No mushrooms here, but once you saw a boar digging just nearby. A reminder you're not the only one who forages, and some creatures don't share well. You listen. Just birdsong and breeze. Good. You move on. Your basket's half full now. Not a feast, but not bad either. A few berries, herbs, some nuts. If you add barley from home and boil everything together, it becomes a meal. Not because any one ingredient is exciting, but because together they become enough. It's funny. You think how foraging's both the most ancient and the most overlooked form of cooking. There's no recipe, just instinct, passed down hand seasons, and the willingness to kneel in mud for something edible. You catch sight of something pink just beyond the tree line. Rose hips. You hustle closer and pluck them carefully. Sour, full of seeds, but high in what modern people might call vitamins. You just know they make you feel a little less tired in winter. Fun fact, some nobles banned peasants from foraging on their land, even though the woods had been common ground for generations. People got around it, of course. A night walk here, a quiet morning there. Historians still argue whether these restrictions led to organized protest, quiet rebellion, or just more creative hiding places. You crouch once more, stretch your back, and shake your basket gently. It rustles like dry leaves. It's enough for today. As you head home, you pass a child tugging at their mother's skirt, holding up a squashed berry with pride. You smile. They'll learn. You did too, because in the Middle Ages you either foraged or you hungered. You wake early, even before the rooster, to the clatter of clay bowls and the thin smell of last night's porridge crust still lingering in the air. Breakfast isn't a meal, it's a whisper of one. Just enough to get you moving. Maybe a hunk of stale bread soaked in ale, or the crust from yesterday's barley loaf, softened with a bit of milk if the goat was kind. But today is different. Today there's flour on the table. Not the fine pale flour of noble feasts, but coarse stone-ground stuff with flecks of bran and maybe a pebble or two if the miller was sloppy. You're making flatbread. Or, more accurately, your version of flatbread, something between a pancake, a cracker, and whatever dough the fire didn't destroy. Because ovens, those big stone beasts you picture in castles, aren't part of your world. Not unless you rent time at the village bakehouse where the communal oven runs once or twice a week, swallowing your shaped dough in exchange for a fee or a barter. So today, it's griddle bread, fire skillet, maybe a greased stone. You mix flour with water, maybe a pinch of salt, if it's payday. You stir it with your hands, thick and sticky. You slap it flat, and then you wait watching the surface bubble and blister while the edges blacken, then crisp. The result is hot, chewy, smoky. You tear it apart with fingers that already smell like smoke and ash. It tastes honest, earthy, like effort. Bread is everywhere, and yet nowhere near the fluffy white loaves you might imagine. Your daily bread. It's dark heavy, sometimes sour. Rye and barley are your staples. Wheat's a luxury, often out of reach, unless you live near a kind landowner or a charitable priest. Here's a fun detail. Bread was so central to medieval life that people measured wealth in grain. Taxes were sometimes paid in wheat or rye. Entire villages were judged by their yield and your survival. It hinges on how well the harvest went last year or whether the rats were hungry. Scholars still argue whether the bread crisis years when crops failed and grain prices soared had more to do with climate war or just bad luck. But for you, the cause doesn't matter. The outcome does. You break a piece of your bread and dip it into a stew pot, simmering with yesterday's leftovers. That's another trick. Nothing is ever wasted. A few turnip skins, wild herbs, onion tops, and the crust of old bread become something comforting when left on the fire long enough. If you're lucky, there's a bone in it. Not for meat, there's barely any left, but for the flavor. Bone broth, you've heard someone call it, though to you it's just Tuesday. Another thing you might eat, peas pudding, which, let's be honest, sounds more cheerful than it is. It's mashed yellow peas, boiled into paste, sometimes salted, occasionally spiced, but usually bland and beige, a bit like eating warm, wet chalk, except you're grateful for every spoonful. And then there's pottage. Oh, pottage. That endlessly versatile, perpetually simmering stew of whatever's around. It might contain kale beans, onions, leeks, and on truly festive occasions a piece of meat or a lump of lard. You ladle it out, day after day, thickening with time. It's both food and preservation method, the medieval version of meal prep, if you will. You glance at the bread again. It's hardened now the way it always does, within an hour of baking. Sometimes you crumble it into milk to soften it back. Other times it becomes trencher bread plates made from dough soaked with sauce, eaten after the meal, or tossed to dogs or beggars. Yes, even your plate is edible. A quirky tidbit monks used to document bread rules. How much each brother received, what kind, and when. Some got one thick hunk per meal, others only half. And during Lent or fasting periods, bread might be denied entirely, which sounds holy in theory, but miserable in practice. You think of the time the baker's apprentice accidentally used spoiled yeast. The village bread turned bitter flat and gave half the kids stomach aches. But no one threw it away. You toasted it by the fire, smeared it with fat, and chewed slowly. Because hunger changes what tasty means. One more historical fact: some bread was adulterated, especially in cities, to stretch supply. Bakers added chalk ground beans, even sawdust. Laws were passed, fines issued, and yet people still ate it. What else could they do? You wrap the last piece of today's bread in a cloth and tuck it away. It'll go with you to the fields or the forest or wherever you labor next. Cold and tough by noon, but still food. Because in the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just part of the meal, it was the meal. And while nobles sliced their trenchers with silver knives, you'll bite straight into yours with calloused hands and grateful silence. It's market day. You pull your cloak tighter, more out of habit than cold, as you walk the winding road toward the village green. The smell hits you before the sights do. Hay, sweat, fresh onions. Maybe a goat that didn't get the memo about manners. The sound follows. Next, boots on packed earth wheels, creaking chickens, protesting their cages, and a voice hawking fresh fish. This morning's catch. You arrive not to shop, but to look. Because market day for someone like you is less about buying and more about bartering, sniffing, and soaking in what you can't afford. You pass by stalls with salted herring lined up like little gray soldiers, and salted eels coiled into barrels, their eyes long gone, but their smell very much present. They're not fresh, but they last, which makes them valuable. Fish, in fact, is one of the few meats poor folks might actually eat if you live near a river or the coast. Or if it's Friday and the church insists you go meatless. Some nobles count beaver tail as fish just to get around the rules. Historians still debate whether that was clever adaptation or flat-out culinary cheating. You step closer to a woman selling cheese wrapped in cloth. It's firm, yellowish, and smells like a foot's been living in it, but in a good way. You ask for a taste, and she gives you a crumb, sharp, salty, with a bite that makes your mouth water. Cheese is one of the few proteins you might actually manage at home. If you have a goat, or know someone who owes you a favor, you keep moving. You pass stalls with dried beans, lentils, chickpeas, broad beans, all stacked in neat cloth sacks. These are the backbone of your meals, dense, long-lasting, and blessedly cheap. You'd trade almost anything for a few handfuls. Your fingers twitch toward the pouch at your waist, holding what little coin you have. But not yet. You're still surveying. Next, the grain merchant. His scales are well worn, and his eyes sharper than a tax collector's. He offers rye, barley, oats, wheat, if you want to feel poor and mocked. You pretend not to notice the weevils crawling in the bottom of one sack. Everyone sees them. No one says a word. You glance across the square to the fruit seller. apples bruised but sweet, pears the hard kind that ripen only after weeks on a windowsill, plums that look almost too soft. You swipe a sample. When he turns his back, one small bite, tart and juicy, before you vanish into the crowd again. It's not noble, but it's not uncommon either. Call it market tax. And then the real gold spices, not saffron or cinnamon. You'd need a king's purse for those, but mustard seeds, wild thyme, and maybe a pinch of pepper if the vendors had a lucky import. Pepper is currency, not seasoning. Some call it black gold. You call it something you'll never taste. Still, you sniff the air like you might inhale a trace. It makes your nose tingle. That's enough. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval towns employed ale tasters and bread weighers on market days, officials tasked with tasting and weighing food to make sure vendors weren't cheating. Imagine being the lucky soul paid to drink beer all morning under the pretense of justice. Historians still argue whether these officials were genuinely effective or just glorified freeloaders. You pass a butcher's stall, but it's not what you picture. No steaks, no rows of ribs. Instead, there are offcuts, blood sausage, tongue, heart, tripe. The parts nobody else wants. The parts you might just afford. You remember the last time you bought liver. You fried it with onions, added vinegar, and pretended it was steak. It wasn't, but it was warm, rich, and it stayed in your belly longer than beans. You finally reached the egg cellar. Brown eggs, still speckled with dirt and feathers. One or two cracked ones sit in a separate basket, cheaper, but risky. You point offer 3 beans and a favor. She eyes you, then nods. Deal. Eggs in hand, you weave your way back toward the village edge. You didn't buy much, but you learned plenty. What's fresh, what's scarce, who's new, and which neighbor might be open to trade later. And then you pass a priest handing out scraps from the manor's kitchen, mostly stale bread, maybe an old apple tart. If you're lucky, a lump of pork fat. You nod politely. He hands you a wedge of hard cheese already beginning to crack at the edges. It smells divine. Funny, isn't it, how markets are less about money and more about movement of food, of favors, of news. In your world, gossip is a form of currency and knowledge about food is survival. You head home with your eggs, your gossip, and your dignity intact. Because even when your pockets are empty, your hands and your eyes are never idle. By the time you return home, the fire's low, and the stew pot is right where you left it, still crusted at the rim, still vaguely steaming. You drop your eggs carefully on the table as if they might explode from excitement, then reach for the ladle. But before you eat, there's one task left. One very particular medieval task. You go check on the herbs. They're drying near the hearth, strung up like little leafy chandeliers. Not for decoration, for flavor, and sometimes for healing. Because while poor people might not dine on pheasant or figs, they're surprisingly clever when it comes to making bland food taste less like suffering. You reach for thyme, not the fancy imported kind, just the wild stuff that grows in patches near the fields. You crush a few sprigs between your fingers and toss them into the stew. Instantly the smell changes, earthy, sharper almost, hopeful. Herbs are your secret weapon. Sage for fat, rosemary for roots, mint when your breath starts to mirror your lunch. Sometimes you'll chew parsley, not because you like it, but because you need it, especially after sharing garlic-heavy bean paste with everyone on your bench at church. You stir the pot again. The stew's thickened nicely. The onions have melted into sweetness. The carrots have turned soft, and the beans have gone from stubborn to submissive. You crack one egg and swirl and watch it bloom into ribbons. It's the kind of detail that feels like wealth. You sit and eat slowly. Because here's the truth, you don't get dessert. Not often. When you do, it's simple. Honey, if you're lucky. Fruit, if you're luckier. But mostly, you finish your meal with more stew. Still, there are moments of sweetness. On certain feast days, St. John's Michaelmas, or Christmas, you might get a hand-sized tart, made with leftover flour lard, maybe some dried apples or pears. If you can trade or steal a spoon of honey, you'll drizzle it on top and pretend you're royalty. Another dish when sugar isn't a fantasy. Frumenti. A thick wheat porridge boiled with milk spiced with what little you have, maybe a raisin or two if a traveler passed through last month and dropped one. It's considered celebratory, which tells you how low the bar is set. Now a quirky tradition during some holy days. People made soul cakes, small round spiced buns given to the poor in exchange for prayers for the dead. You'd go door to door singing and begging, and in return, you'd get food. Historians still argue whether this was an early form of trick-or-treating or just seasonal charity disguised as piety. Back to your meal. You're halfway through your bowl when a neighbor knocks. She's holding a jug. It's weak ale, barely alcoholic, but far safer than the water which runs thick with whatever upstream farmers have decided to wash into it. You accept the jug, pour 2 cups, and sit together in silence. This is community. It isn't just people. It's shared meals, shared hunger, and the constant, unspoken game of what can we cook with this? Your neighbor tells you she traded 3 eggs for a lump of tallow and used it to fry pancakes made from oats and turnips. You raise an eyebrow. She shrugs. Better than raw turnip, she says. Fair point. Speaking of drinks, let's talk beverages. Poor people don't have wine unless it's sour leftovers from the priest's table. Instead, it's ale, small beer, sometimes cider. Children drink it too. Not because anyone's throwing keggers in the sandbox, but because water is often dangerous. Fermented drinks are safer, and besides, they fill you up. A strange tidbit. Some towns had communal brewing schedules where neighbors took turns using the same giant cauldron. That way, everyone got a chance to make their week's drink. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. You pour another cup of ale. It's flat, yeasty, slightly warm. But you've had worse. Now there's a debate among scholars about whether poor people in the Middle Ages were perpetually malnourished or just moderately hungry all the time. Some studies of skeletons suggest stunted growth, bad teeth, and signs of long-term food stress. Others argue that people adapted growing hardy on gruels and stews, using herbs for nutrients, and surviving on seasonal rhythms that modern diets would collapse under. You look at your empty bowl and try to decide which theory is more comforting. The sun is fading now. Your house is dim lit by firelight and the flickering reflections off the stew pot. You rinse your dish with the last of the boiled water, wipe it with cloth, and hang it by the wall. Tomorrow maybe you'll roast onions over coals. Maybe make peas pudding again. Or maybe it'll be another turnip stew with bits of stale bread fried crisp like croutons. Fancy word. You just call them toasted crumbs. One last thing before bed, you pull a small wooden box from under the bed. Inside is a rare treasure salt. You pinch just enough to sprinkle over tomorrow's meal. Not too much. The box must last until the spring fair, when a trader might come through with a fresh supply. You close it, gently place it back in its hiding spot, and feel the slight weight of satisfaction. Because in your world, food isn't about flavors or plating or luxury. It's about survival, yes, but also creativity, ritual, memory, and the quiet, stubborn joy of making something warm from almost nothing at all. The next morning, you wake to the sound of roosters arguing with the church bells. Your belly isn't full, but it isn't empty either. A small luxury in your life. You stretch under the wool blanket, scratch at the itch in your woolen tunic, and sniff the air for any sign of breakfast. Nope, still smells like last night's stew and the damp stone of the cottage walls. You sit up already planning your first move forage, because when you're poor in the Middle Ages, you don't always start your day with food on the table. Sometimes you start with your feet in mud and your fingers in bushes, looking for something edible-ish. You slip outside, careful not to wake the kids or the goat. The air is cool, thick with morning mist. You head for the hedgerows, along the field path. This is where the real treasure lives. Wild greens, nettles, dock leaves, maybe a late mushroom if the weather's been right and the local pigs haven't beaten you to it. Mushrooms are a gamble. Some will make your stew better. Some will make your vision worse. Historians still debate whether medieval foragers had reliable knowledge of edible fungi or just a good sense of trial and error, with heavy emphasis on the error. You spot a few nettles, bright green and just young enough to cook without your tongue staging a revolt. With a quick cut of your blade and a wince at the sting, you gather a bundle. Nettles are better boiled, fried if you're lucky, raw only if you're trying to prove a point to your neighbor. Back home, you toss the greens in the pot, add a splash of yesterday's ale, and a chunk of onion. It's thin soup, but it's hot, and hot food in the Middle Ages is nearly always a blessing. You call the kids. They slurp it down without question. They know better than to complain. Complaints don't add calories. You sip yours, slowly, eyes flicking to the bread crusts you've saved. They're hard as bricks, but a little soaking, and they'll soften up. Bread, like this coarse brown, sometimes full of bark filler, was called horse bread in some parts of Europe. Yes, it was technically made for animals. But let's be honest, you're in some ways competing with animals for food. By midday, it's time to think ahead preservation. If you have any extra greens, you'll dry them. If you've managed to trap a rabbit, or more likely if someone else has, and you've managed to get a scrap, you'll smoke or salt what you can't cook today. Salt is currency. You've probably heard that Roman soldiers were paid in it. That's where the word salary comes from. And while that may be slightly exaggerated, the idea of salt as wealth certainly holds true in your world. You store yours like treasure, and only use it when the threat of rot outweighs the threat of flavor. You look to your root cellar. It's more like a hole in the ground with sticks over it, but it's yours. Inside are turnips, a few onions, and a single apple. You count them like coins. Now here's the quirky bit. Some households used coffins. Yes, literal wooden boxes shaped like coffins, not for the dead, but for storing pies. Meat pies. The crust was rock hard and not meant to be eaten. It was a medieval Tupperware. Historians still argue whether the wealthy actually ate the crusts or just tossed them to the servants. If you ever found one, you'd eat the box too. Mid-afternoon rolls in with a warm wind. You gather herbs, some for flavor, some for medicine. Dandelions for the liver, fennel to ease the belly, chamomile if someone can't sleep. You don't have a doctor. You are the doctor. Or at least the one with the least wrong guesses. A neighbor stops by with news a pig is being slaughtered down by the mill. Not yours, of course. But you might get some scraps, lungs, feet ears, if you show up fast. You do. You stand in line with others, clutching a cloth sack, watching as the larger cuts are claimed by those with more coin or favor. By the time it's your turn, you're handed a tail, that's it. A pig's tail. You nod. Grateful. You know how to make broth from this. You know how to scrape, boil, and stretch it into something that might taste like meat if you close your eyes hard enough. Back home, you toss it into a pot with whatever else you've got, a few beans, some greens, a sliver of onion. Let it boil until the tail dissolves into the mix. It'll be dinner. As it cooks, you mend socks. Your children nap. The sun slants through the cracks in your wall, painting golden bars on the floor. You smell the broth and feel oddly a little rich. There's a rhythm to this life, a ritual. It doesn't change much, but that's the comfort in it. You eat what's available. You stretch what's left. You hope tomorrow brings more mushrooms and fewer stings. Tonight you'll serve soup again. But there's meat in it. Just a bit. Enough to make the children ask if there's more. Enough to make the youngest lick the bowl. And when they're asleep and the fire's burned low, you'll take one last ladle for yourself. It's thin. It's salty. It's humble. But it's yours. You wake the next day to the echo of hooves on packed earth and the distant creak of a cart. That can only mean one thing, market day. It doesn't happen every day sometimes, not even every week, but when it does, you move like a person possessed. Because while you don't have much coin, you do have eggs, maybe a bunch of foraged greens, and possibly, just possibly, a handful of dried mushrooms to barter. And that's currency enough to go looking for something different, something better. You pull your tunic over your head, grab your basket, and step outside. The road is already speckled with people hobbling, old women in wool cloaks barefoot, children chasing geese, a man wheeling something that probably used to be a wheelbarrow, but now looks like a box with dreams. The smell of fried onions and sheep dung mingles in the breeze. As you approach the market, the sound grows. People haggling, shouting, selling. A man's yelling about onions. Another is yelling about his onions being fresher. You wander past both. You're not here for onions. You're hunting for luxury, which in your world means a wedge of cheese, a half loaf of yesterday's rye, or be still your beating heart, a bit of dried fish. You stop at the fishmonger's cart. He smells like regret and salt. You ask the price of the smallest herring, and he eyes your eggs with the same calculation you just gave his fish. You trade. One egg, one herring. It's a win. You tuck the fish deep into your basket like a jewel. But let's be honest, even on market day, your feast is still someone else's scrap. The wealthy merchants and minor nobles walk through with purses that jingle and servants who carry their purchases. They buy pies wrapped in pastry honey cakes, jugs of imported ale, even dried dates if the trade routes are open. You're here for bones, quite literally. There's a butcher who sells bones for boiling, and if you smile just right, or if your child coughs in a way that sounds particularly pathetic, he'll toss in an extra knuckle or two. Historians still debate whether market vendors showed real charity or simply gave scraps to keep the peace. Either way, you've learned how to be visible but non-threatening, desperate but polite, grateful but not groveling. Back home you lay out your spoils: one dried fish, 3 turnips, a fistful of nettles, a few bones, a real patchwork, but to you, it's potential. Tonight you'll make something that tastes like effort, maybe even love. But first you nibble the corner of the rye bread you bought for half a cup of beans. It's sour, crusty, and just starting to mold. Perfect. You tear off the green part, flick it aside, and pretend it never happened. Bread in the Middle Ages is like air. You need it, but you rarely think about it, except when it's gone. Then it's everything. Most of the bread you eat is made from rye or barley. Wheat is for the rich. And even then, it's a whole process: grind, sift, knead, bake. Not everyone has an oven. So sometimes you take your dough to the communal bakehouse. That's right, entire villages share ovens. Each family marks their loaves with a special sign or slash, so no one nicks your bread. Of course, mistakes happen. Mistakes. Bread goes missing. Sometimes it reappears half-eaten with a note about a misunderstanding. And then there's maslin bread, a mixture of rye and wheat. Historians still argue whether it was considered inferior or simply economical. You'd never know. You've never had it. But you have heard that it tastes like real bread, not the heavy gray bricks you chew on most days. Later that day, a neighbor stops by. She's holding a pot and asking if you've got any salt. You do, just a pinch. But in return, she offers something rare goose grease, rendered golden and smoky. You say yes, obviously. Because here's the thing, fat makes poor people's food better, not just tastier, fuller, more filling. A dab of grease on bread transforms it. A spoonful in broth thickens. It makes it feel like a meal. You taste it with the reverence of a priest sipping sacrament. There's a ritual in how you share. You don't write it down, but you remember the favors, the exchanges, the quiet generosity of one turnip for one story, one herb for one night of borrowed firewood. The sun begins to drop and you start the fire. Your stew tonight is better than usual. The fish gives it body. The bones give it depth. The nettles give it bite. And the goose fat, well, the goose fat gives it soul. You eat slowly, savoring each mouthful like it's a roast from a noble's table. And you imagine for just a moment that tomorrow you'll buy a pie, a real one, with filling. That thought alone might be enough to carry you through the week. You wake to the familiar sound of snoring yours, probably, and the thin light of a sun that can't decide if it wants to be helpful today. Your back aches from the straw mattress, which is less a mattress and more a slightly organized pile of poking. You stretch, yawn, and think one inevitable thought. What's for breakfast? The answer, of course, is maybe nothing. Because unlike the wealthy who might break their fast with white bread cheese, maybe even imported fruit, you begin your day with something between hope and habit. If there's leftover pottage from yesterday, that's your meal. If not, you scrounge. Let's talk about pottage, actually. It's the medieval answer to everything. A sort of eternal stew, always bubbling, always changing, with whatever you can spare. A few beans, some greens, a chunk of yesterday's bread soaked until it forgets it was stale. You don't make pottage so much as live with it, add to it, stir it, apologize to it when it tastes wrong. Today, you manage a scoop. It's thinner than you'd like. You stir in a handful of barley. It gives the illusion of volume, and illusion is half the point. It's also full of fiber, which historians agree helped medieval peasants avoid some digestive disasters the rich actually suffered more from, thank the endless meat and lack of roughage on noble tables. You tear a corner from your crust of brown bread and let it soak. The bread is heavy. It's closer to brick than biscuit, full of rye bran, sometimes even pea flour. In times of famine, you've eaten bread padded with sawdust. And no, that's not a joke. That happened. Historians still debate whether people knew or simply didn't care. While you chew and chew, you hear the village bell ring. It's market inspection day, which is a fancy way of saying someone with power is coming to check if the scales are honest and the bread is legal. Ah, yes, bread laws. Because in the Middle Ages, food wasn't just survival, it was politics. There were laws about how big a loaf had to be, what it could be made of, and how much it should weigh. If your baker cheated you, he could be tied to a cart and paraded around town. Public shaming, the medieval Yelp review. You once saw a baker dunked in a pond with his own underweight loaves tied around his neck. He came out soggy and sheepish. The loaves didn't survive. But back to you. You finished breakfast, if it can be called that, and now your thoughts turn to tomorrow. Preservation again. Today you plan to dry apples. You only have 2 slightly bruised, but that's still something. You slice them thin, well, as thin as your dull knife will allow, and lay them on a wooden board in the sun. If the clouds hold off and the birds stay generous, you'll have a small stash for later. Not enough to feed you, but enough to flavor a dull meal, or sweeten water, or bribe a child into silence. Apples in your world are more than fruit. They're time machines. You taste one, and for a moment you remember autumn, the smell of smoke, the sound of geese. They're also, weirdly, a religious symbol. You've heard priests say, Eve ruined everything with one. You think that's a lot of blame for one fruit. Speaking of flavor, you check your herb shelf. It's a joke, really. 2 jars, a bag of dried fennel, and a pinch of sage. But in your house, this is wealth. Seasoning turns thin soup into a dish, turns dull bread into memory. You grind some fennel between your fingers and inhale, sweet licorice-like and utterly magical. That afternoon you visit a friend, Marna, who's boiling cabbage. The smell hits you before you knock. You exchange a handful of dried mushrooms for a ladle of her broth. Neither of you says much. It's not rudeness. It's economy. You save words like you save onions for when they're really needed. Marna mentions a rumor. The manor might host a feast soon. A real one. Nobles. Guests. Roast boar. You laugh. Because feasts in your world are dreams with smells. You hear them more than you see them, floating downwind, echoing from stone halls. Once you worked a feast, carried trays, cleaned bones, and yes, you stole a bite. Just one. It was cold, greasy, and the best thing you've ever eaten. Historians still argue about how often the poor attended feasts. Some say rarely. Others say servants had access. You say this crumbs fall from every table. You just have to be fast enough to catch them. As evening creeps in, you boil the last of your lentils. They take forever. You stir slowly, like it might convince the pot to fill itself. You throw in a leaf of cabbage, salt, a tiny knob of dried beef from a lucky trade last week. The broth turns cloudy, rich. You imagine it's stew, thick and hearty. You lie a little to your children, say there's more meat than there is. They eat faster, believe you. After they sleep, you sit by the fire and finish the last spoonful. And in that moment, with nothing left and everything quiet, you feel full. Not just from food, but from trying, from surviving, from making something out of nothing again and again and again. You wake to a soft rattle outside, perhaps the wind, perhaps the neighbor's chickens staging another escape. Either way, it's morning again. And that means inevitably hunger again. Today is what you might call a lean day, though. Let's be honest, most days are lean. But this one is especially so. The pot is nearly empty. The bread box echoes. You stare into your larder like it might sprout something just from your gaze. You scrape together what you can. Half an onion, a few shriveled parsnips, a bit of sour ale that's too sour to drink. Perfect. You're making ale soup. Don't laugh, it's a thing. Actually, in your world, it's a necessary thing. Ale was everywhere in the medieval world. Even children drank it. Not the boozy kind, but a weaker, small ale made to be safer than water. Because the water, full of things that could ruin your week or your life. So, yes, you simmer your vegetables in ale, add a pinch of salt, precious salt, and hope the flavors melt into something more than the sum of their parts. While it simmers, you step outside. The wind smells like wood smoke and damp wool. You nod to the neighbor who's already tending his goat. The goat eyes you with suspicion. You nod back. This is as close to diplomacy as today will get. You pass a woman gathering nettles. She's careful, gloved hands, long sleeves. Nettles sting, but boiled. They're as soft and earthy as spinach. In a way, nettles are spinach for people who can't afford spinach. She gives you a smile and holds out a bunch. You hesitate, then trade her the heel of your bread. A fair deal, all things considered. You return home victorious. The ale soup is bubbling now, and you toss in the nettles. The smell changes richer, greener. You feel a tiny spark of pride. You've turned leftovers and weeds into dinner. As it cooks, your thoughts wander. What did your ancestors eat? You remember your grandfather's stories, how they used to dry peas until they clicked like stones, or eat acorn bread in famine years, bitter coarse and made with hours of soaking and leaching to remove toxins. A desperate food, but still food. Historians still debate whether medieval peasants had more variety than we think. Some argue, yes, wild greens, herbs, foraged mushrooms, berries in season. Others say those were rare treats. You think depends on the year and the luck. The conversation often ignores something vital, how much work it all took. Food didn't just appear. Every bean, every root, every clump of barley flour harvested, dried, stored, protected. A mouse could wipe out a week's meals. A moldy sack of grain, ruinous. You've cried over rotted cabbage, over spoiled milk, over a broken pot, not because you're weak, but because food is fragile, and so are you. Still, there's joy in small victories. The ale soup is done. You ladle it carefully. The broth is sharp. The onions tender, the nettles a green thread through the whole thing. It's not delicious, but it's warm and filling, and you made it. You set aside a bowl for the neighbor, the one with the goat. Why? Because he let you borrow firewood last week. Because he shares news. Because kindness is a kind of currency, and you intend to stay wealthy in that way at least. After the meal, you rinse your bowl with hot water and a twist of hay. No soap here, just scrub and rinse. Tomorrow, it'll hold the same soup again, maybe. Or just hot water with herbs. As the sun fades, you bundle a few roots in cloth and stash them in the corner. Your winter stores are running low. You count each turnip like gold. And just before bed, you gnaw a piece of dried apple, thin, chewy, sharp, with sweetness. You saved it from last week's sun drying, and now in this quiet it feels extravagant. A treat. A memory of markets and laughter. Your body is tired, but it's fed. That's something. You lie on your straw and listen to the wind slip between the boards of the wall. Someone coughs, far off. A dog barks once, then nothing. The world for now is calm, and your belly is full enough, which in this century is a miracle. Morning light spills through the cracks in the shutter, and the rooster across the lane is late but loud. You roll over stiff-limbed, not from luxury, but from yesterday's labor. And like every other day, your thoughts drift immediately to food. Today is baking day, or rather, it should be if you can manage enough flour. You rummage through the sack near the hearth. There's still some left coarse brown flour, speckled with bits of husk. Not enough for a proper loaf, but enough for something. Maybe flatbread. Maybe a kind of cake made of lies and hope. Baking in your world is both sacred and survival. You mix the flour with water from the barrel, a pinch of salt, and if you're lucky, a smidge of old yeast from the last batch. No fancy sourdough starters here, just what clings to the sides of the mixing bowl like a secret. You knead it roughly. No technique, just force and fatigue. The dough is sticky and stubborn, like most things in your life. But it comes together eventually. You let it sit near the hearth to rise, though you know it won't rise much. Brown bread doesn't puff like the white loaves the clergy get. Still, it's something. As it rests, your mind wanders. Bread is everything here. It's not just a food. It's currency, communion comfort. The assize of bread and ale. Those medieval laws again say how big, how heavy, how pure it must be. A corrupt baker risks public punishment. A dishonest one might be flogged. You remember when the village baker tried to hide pebbles in his dough to make it heavier? He swore they were mineral supplements. The Lord didn't laugh. He spent a night in the stocks, his loaves used as projectiles by giggling children. You sigh. You've never had enough flour to be tempted into deceit. You add a handful of chopped leeks to your dough, mostly for flavor, but also for texture. Sometimes you grind dried beans and mix them in. It stretches the batch, even if it makes the loaf dense enough to qualify as weaponry. Once it's ready, you shape small rounds and lay them on a hot stone. Your home doesn't have a real oven that belongs to the manor. Instead, you cook with patience. Flip press, wait. The smell fills your small hut. Not luxurious, but homey. Warmth, steam, the yeasty aroma of something earned. One bread round sticks. You pry it off with a grunt. Another one cracks, you sigh, but don't waste it. Broken food is still food. That's a law older than any king. While they cool, a child appears at the door.
Yours? Or maybe your neighbor's? You don't ask anymore. Kids come and go, bound more by hunger than blood. You hand them around, warn them to chew slowly. They don't listen, but you try. Lunch is 2 bread rounds dipped in a weak broth from the last cabbage core. You chew slowly, not for flavor, but to convince your brain that it's enough. Then it's time to store the rest. You wrap each in cloth and place them in the hanging basket above the hearth. Keeps the rats away most of the time. You still remember the night they found your stash. The sounds, the fury, the hunger that followed. Historians still argue how often poor families lost their stores to pests or mold. Some say daily life was constant replacement. Others claim these disruptions were rare but dramatic. You just know it hurts when it happens. Your afternoon is spent bartering. You take 2 rounds of bread to the weaver's wife, who trades you a half-dozen eggs, small, speckled, and fragile. You walk home like their treasure. The eggs go into the same cloth bag you use for everything. Bread mushrooms, sometimes secrets. You clutch it close all the way home. Tonight's supper, 1 scrambled egg each. You add a pinch of parsley because luxury comes in leaves. You eat by firelight. The kids are quiet, focused. The bread disappears too fast. You try not to count bites. It's not polite, but you do it anyway. When the fire dies down, you rake coals over the last of the warmth and tuck the cloth-wrapped bread near your feet. Heat and hunger, side by side. As sleep presses in, you feel that dull ache behind your ribs, the kind that's not quite pain, not quite emptiness, just the absence of more. Still you fed your family, still you baked, and that for today is enough. The frost has returned. You can see it, feathering across the tiny window pane, in delicate white threads, beautiful, if it didn't mean such brutal things for the day ahead. You exhale slowly and watch your breath cloud in the cold air. The hearth is dark, and your fingers ache before you've even left the blanket. No time for complaint. Today is market day. Not the fun kind either. No coins in your pouch. No long list of wares to fetch. No, you're going to sell. You unwrap your last turnip cake, flattened yesterday, fried in goose grease, saved from a rare feast weeks ago. The smell is faint, but still there, earthy, oily, almost indulgent. You hesitate. You could eat it. You want to eat it, but you need salt more than you need satisfaction. So you wrap it up again and slide it into a cloth sack, along with a bundle of dried mushrooms and a single skein of wool your aunt spun in summer. Not much, but maybe enough for a pinch of salt or a broken pot to replace the one the dog shattered last week. The dog's name, incidentally, is Cheese, because Cheese once was a dog who stole cheese. You laugh quietly at the memory. Cheese is still alive. The pot, not so much. Outside, the world is blanketed in white mist. The path to the village market is slick with mud and straw. You dodge a cartwheel nod to the miller's boy and join the slow shuffle toward the stalls. Market day is noisy, but not chaotic. People don't have enough energy for chaos here. You pass a man selling tripe pies, awful, stuffed in pastry not for the faint of heart or strong of stomach. He's shouting about freshness, but you know he lives next to the tannery. Nothing smells fresh there. Another woman is trading herbs. You recognize lavender sage and comfrey. She eyes your mushrooms. Last year's? She asks. No, last month. Oak-ringed, south of the river. She sniffs one, then nods. Half hand of salt. You shake your head. Whole hand. And a cracked bowl. A pause. A frown. Then, done. Trade completed. Mushrooms for salt. And a bowl with only a hairline fracture. You cradle it like glass. While you barter for a sprig of thyme with your wool skein, you overhear two men debating again whether monks hoard the good cheese. Historians still argue this, too funnily enough. Monasteries were notorious for producing better food than the average household. Some claim it was for spiritual fortitude. Others whisper it was simply greed under holy robes. You suspect it's somewhere in the middle, like most things. You take a break at the edge of the square, sitting on a crumbling wall, warmed faintly by the weak sun. You nibble a crust you packed. A child next to you, maybe 7, eyes you without blinking. You break it in half. They take it without a word. Sharing is law here. Unspoken, but enforced, with eyebrows. You hear a shout. A pig has escaped. Market entertainment. You smile. On your way home, you pass the butcher. He's boiling bones for stock, and the scent is rich. He lets you dip your cracked bowl for a sip. Bone broth. Liquid gold. It tastes like survival. The return journey feels lighter despite the weight of salt in your pocket. You'll boil cabbage tonight. Maybe even sprinkle a pinch of salt, just a pinch, to remind your family that food can still taste like memory. You pass a hedgerow, and without thinking, you pluck a handful of sloes, bitter purple, hard as sin. You'll soak them in ale for a month, maybe. Make something festive, or close enough. At home, Cheese greets you with enthusiasm and damp paws. You toss him a turnip peel. He thinks it's prime rib. Dinner is quiet. The kids talk about market day like it's theater. You listen and nod and smile. And when the fire is low and the last bowl is licked clean and the salt is safely hidden beneath a loose floor tile, you feel rich, not in coins, but in survival. The rain won't stop. It began last night, tapping like fingers on the roof, and now it drums, steadily soaking everything it touches. The fields are puddles. The path is a moat, and even the inside of your boots has given up.
You wring your cloak out at the door, and it makes a sound like a dying sponge. Today isn't a day for farming or fishing, or even for chopping wood. It's a day for staying dry, which in your world is nearly impossible. But hunger doesn't care about weather, so you adapt. You reach for the nettles. Behind your house, under the eaves where the chickens sometimes hide, grows a patch of stinging nettles. Most people avoid them. You welcome them like an old grumpy friend. Gloves on you, pluck the top leaves, young and green, less likely to make your tongue regret its life choices. Inside, you rinse them 3 times and boil them until they surrender. Nettle soup, that's dinner. You add half an onion, a pinch of salt from yesterday's precious trade, and some barley if you're feeling ambitious. Today, you are not. While the pot simmers, you sit by the fire trying to dry your sleeves. Your youngest child pokes their head in and whispers, "Is it ready yet?" You lie and say, "Almost." They lie and say, "I'm not that hungry." This is how love works here. You stir the soup. It smells faintly green, like rain and regret. You ladle it into wooden bowls, worn thin by use and hope. Each child gets one. You keep the smallest portion for yourself. There's a joke in there somewhere about parental masochism, but no one's laughing. You eat in silence. The only sounds are rain breath and the quiet scraping of spoons. You remember when nettles once gave you hives. Now they give you life. That's growth, right? After supper, you patch a tunic by candlelight. The sleeve tore days ago, and you've been meaning to fix it. You use thread from an old hem needle from your grandmother and determination from somewhere deeper. The tunic belonged to your older child. Now it's their siblings. Later, it might be yours again. Clothes, like stories, are passed down, patched and reimagined. There's a knock at the door. You tense. Visitors are rare. It's Marta, your neighbor, soaked through and clutching a basket of wilted herbs. "Want to trade?" she asks, teeth chattering. You nod. You offer a crust of yesterday's bread in exchange. She grins like it's gold. She sits by the fire. You talk about weather crops, the baker's new apprentice who supposedly burned 30 loaves in one day. You both agree he must be cursed, or blind, or both. Marta leaves with her bread, and you with her limp time. You add it to tomorrow's mental menu. When the fire dies down, you watch the coals like they're a story you're trying to decode. Your children sleep in the loft, above soft snores, soft dreams. You curl up on the floor, cloak over you like a shield. The rain taps again. You think about how nettles sting, but only if handled wrong. If approached with care, they're food, healing, survival. Historians still debate whether nettles were a staple or an emergency fallback in poor households. Some say they were common. Others argue they were a sign of desperation. You know the truth is wetter, colder, and lived. You drift off to sleep with the faint taste of soup still on your tongue. Tomorrow, the rain might stop, or not. Either way, you'll eat. The sun is finally out.
It's low, pale, and still doesn't warm much, but after days of soggy skies and muddy boots, you'll take what you can get. The thatch roof is steaming gently in the morning light, drying like laundry left too long. You step outside and squint. The air smells of earth-damp wool, and if you're honest cow, your neighbor is already up, waving cheerfully with a rake in one hand and a pail of goat's milk in the other. You wave back with your crust of rye bread. That's breakfast again. You chew slowly, very slowly. It's not bad, but it's not exciting. Coarse rye, barely risen full of bran and seeds that stick in your teeth and don't let go. Still, it fills you. You lean against the door frame watching chickens peck the thawed ground. Their food is your scraps. Your food is not far off. You remember yesterday's soup. The memory makes you grateful and a little sad. You hear footsteps. It's your cousin Jacob. He's young, restless, and built like a tree stump. He carries a sack and a wild idea. Come with me, he grins. We're going to get apples. You blink. It's spring, you say flatly. Leftover ones. In the monastery cellar. Ah, you say, that kind of apple. See, monasteries were technically charitable. They were also food fortresses. Every monk worth his robe had access to better bread, finer fish, and cellars stocked with fruit preserved in honey or vinegar. Rumors say they even had dates, once a gift from a traveling bishop. You don't believe it, but you want to. You follow Jacob anyway. It's not really stealing, he says. The monks won't notice. You're not convinced, but the thought of something sweet is enough to make you walk faster. At the monastery wall, you wait, while Jacob sneaks in through the side gate. You stay behind. Someone has to look innocent. A nearby beggar, real or pretending, mutters a greeting. You hand him the last of your rye crust. He nods without looking. 15 minutes later, Jacob reappears, triumphant, smug, sticky-fingered. He holds out a shriveled, brownish apple. You eat it anyway. It's soft tart and glorious. You both sit under a tree, chewing silently. Jacob leans back, satisfied. Worth it. You nod. Definitely. And for a moment, life tastes like victory. Back home, your aunt is pickling eggs. The smell fills the air, sharp, sulfurous, and oddly comforting. Pickling is both science and luck. If it works, you have food for weeks. If it doesn't, you get sick. Or worse, you help her tuck herbs into the jar. Mustard seeds, bay leaves, pepper, if there's any left. She's out of vinegar, so she's trying ale. Bold. Later, you sit by the fire with a bowl of something not quite stew. It's thick with bits of carrot and what might be rabbit or rat. You don't ask. You dip your crust. It softens instantly. The food is bland but warm, satisfying in a subtle way. Historians today often point out that the medieval peasant diet, despite its monotony, was surprisingly balanced. Grain, legumes, occasional vegetables, a rare dash of meat or dairy. It lacked luxury, yes, but not always nutrition. In fact, some modern dietitians argue it was better for your gut than whatever it is nobility ate. Peasants rarely died from gout, after all. You smile imagining a nobleman bloated from roast swan while you sip your humble turnip broth and live another decade. You won't live forever, but you'll live long enough to remember the apple, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find another one. You wake to the smell of garlic. That's strange, not because it's unusual, but because garlic is a luxury around here, a real one. You might grow a few heads in the corner of your garden if you're lucky. If not, you usually just dream about it. But today, someone's cooking it, and that someone is Marta. Again, she's back at your door before the sun fully crests the ridge. Her cloak is damp at the hem, and her face is alight with excitement. I found wild garlic, she says, holding out a bundle like a prize from the king's own kitchen. The long, flat leaves are muddy, but fragrant, fresh from the forest floor. Let's make bread. You stare at her like she's gone daft. Bread with herbs. For fun. But your stomach growls, and that settles it. You mix flour, coarse barley with warm water, and a pinch of old yeast from the back of the hearth. It smells slightly sour. Perfect. You mash the garlic leaves with a bit of oil and smear the paste into the dough. Then you knead it hard until your arms ache and the dough stops fighting back. It's primitive baking. No oven, just flat stones and fire. But it works. An hour later, you tear into a hot, blistered flatbread that tastes like spring, like something alive. You know, Marta says, between bites, some folks say, garlic keeps the devil away. You snort. Is that why you're still single? She kicks you. You don't mind. Food superstitions are everywhere in your world. People say eating beans on a full moon makes your dreams come true. Drinking milk from a black goat cures nightmares. Bread must always be torn, never cut, unless you want to cut your luck in half. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were genuine or just peasant entertainment. Probably both. When your life is ruled by seasons, animals, and church bells, a little magical thinking helps you feel less exposed. Your own grandmother swore that eating cold porridge on Sunday would make your hair fall out. She was bald by 30, but you still refused to test the theory. That afternoon, the village gathers for a baptism. Food is part of the ritual. A shared loaf passed from hand to hand. Salt sprinkled on the baby's lips, meant to keep lies away. A bit of honey, if anyone can spare it. You get a pinch. It's more precious than coin. Later, you help an old man boil elderberry bark to treat a cough. It smells like dirt and wet socks, but he swears it works. You nod politely. A neighbor tells you they fed their child onion soup to cure nightmares. You're not sure it worked. The child still screams at clouds. Even your chickens aren't exempt. Someone swears feeding them ground mustard seeds makes their eggs bigger. You try it once. They peck your toes in protest. You chalk it up to science or spite. That night you sit alone with a cup of hot water and one last piece of garlic bread. It's gone stale, but the scent lingers. You remember a story your mother used to tell of a boy who ate 3 cloves of garlic every morning and lived to be 112. He also died alone. But no one blamed the garlic. Probably. You smile into the steam. Food isn't just survival. It's story, myth, memory. It fills more than your belly. It feeds your sense of wonder. Even in a world of dirt floors and empty cupboards that counts for something, the seasons shift again. You feel it first in the wind, crisper, thinner, sneaking down your collar, even when the sun still shines. The trees begin to dry and crackle. The fields, once lush with barley and beans, now look tired, like an old man leaning on a stick. Harvest is coming, which means food, finally glorious, abundant food. But also work, relentless, back-breaking, dirty work. You wake earlier than usual, slipping on your stiff boots and tugging your worn cloak over your shoulders. The dew is sharp on the grass, soaking your hem before you make it to the gate. Chickens protest your early movement, clucking like gossiping aunties. Today the village gathers at the main field. Every hand is needed, young, old, aching. Even Marta is here, sleeves rolled up, eyes fierce. The children run between sheaves of grain, laughing and dodging scolds. You bend scythe in hand and cut. Again, again, again. The rhythm is simple, ancient. The same motion your ancestors made and theirs before them. You think about all the food these fields will become. Barley loaves, porridge, maybe even beer, if the monks are generous, or the tax collectors lazy. By midday, your arms burn. By sundown, your soul does too. But tonight the village feasts. It's not much a long table made from barrels and planks covered with whatever food could be spared. There's bean stew with onion barley cakes, dried pears from last autumn. Someone brought ale, someone else cheese with a suspicious smell. You eat everything. A woman sings. Children fall asleep in their mother's laps. You lean back and let your head tilt toward the stars. You remember the nettles, the stale bread, the stolen apple. You think about garlic rituals and mustard-fed chickens. You think about how food wasn't just what kept you alive, it was what kept you together. Historians still argue over how much autonomy medieval peasants had over their food. Some believe the church dictated most meals. Others claim feasts like this, shared, informal, messy, were the true soul of rural life. You've lived it. You know which side you're on. Tomorrow you'll go back to scraping, boiling, stretching, every scrap to make it last. But tonight you are full, not just in the belly, in the spirit. You take one last bite of barley cake and close your eyes. It's rough, dry, sweetened with honey that may or may not be stolen, but it tastes like triumph. You lie on the grass a while longer, letting the sounds of clinking bowls and soft songs fade into the night. The wind is cold now, but your cloak is warm. You've earned the rest. The moon hangs high. The world turns slowly. You let it. And now at the edge of sleep, let's begin to fade. The air grows softer now. The wind eases into something like a sigh, rustling leaves gently, like a mother brushing a child's hair.
You feel your limbs growing heavier, your thoughts slower, like syrup poured into a wooden bowl. The fire has gone low, but not out. Its glow pulses against the walls, casting sleepy shadows that don't need names or stories anymore. Outside, the night stretches across the sky like a wool blanket, star-patched and silent. No shouting, no cutting, no hunger gnawing at your ribs. Just the steady rhythm of a breath, then another. Your eyes follow the embers until they blur. You remember the soup, the bread, the apple that was bruised but beautiful. You remember laughter over simple meals, rituals passed down in whispers, and how even the poorest table could hold a story. There's comfort in that. Not every hunger is loud. Some are quiet. Some are for peace, for silence, for being seen even once at a table full of cracked bowls and tired hands. And tonight you've had enough. So let yourself drift. No need to hold on now. The fields are harvested. The pot is clean. The fire is safe. You've made it through another day. And in this world, this strange, boring, beautiful history, that is everything. Sleep well.